Thank you for participating in today's researcher talk. I'm Richard McCulley, historian at the Center for Legislative Archives, which sponsors this series. In addition to today's presentation, we have planned 2 more researcher talks this year. In October, we'll hear from Molly Michaelmore of Washington and Lee University, who will speak about her research in Senate Finance Committee and House Ways and Means Committee records for her highly regarded book, Tax and Spend, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. And in November, we'll host a longtime friend of the Center, Charles Stewart of MIT, who will discuss a book he co-authored with Wendy Schiller at Brown University, Electing the Senate, Indirect Democracy Before the 17th Amendment, published by Princeton University Press. Today, we're very pleased to host Robert Mutch, author of Buying the Vote, A History of Campaign Finance Reform, published by Oxford University Press. Over the years, Bob has conducted much research in the records of the clerk of the House of Representatives, the office responsible for maintaining reports of political expenditures of political organizations, and it's a vast collection, Box 1, containing reports dating from 1912 to 1916. I was not aware of Bob's research in these records until late last year when I read his book, when Oxford University Press, for very good reasons, nominated it for the Society for History in the Federal Government's 2015 Henry Adams Award for the Best History of the Federal Government. Bob is a political scientist and an independent scholar. He's also written Campaigns, Congress, and Courts, The Making of Federal Campaign Finance Law, published by Prager, which is the only book-length history of federal campaign finance law. His many articles on campaign finance can be found in publications such as Roll Call, the History News Network, and the Boston Globe. He is completing a book on the current state of campaign finance, which he anticipates will be out next year, and he is also writing a chapter on money and politics for the Oxford Handbook of American Political and Policy History. We should have time for Q&A, and before you ask a question, please raise your hand so I can pass the mic.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. I have slides, but you can't see them. I will do my best to describe how beautiful my slides are. I've been writing about the history of campaign finance laws and practices for more than 25 years. But in all that time, I don't think that reform has ever been a hotter topic than it is right now. And what I'm going to suggest in my talk is that we can shed some light on this current policy issue by digging into documents that are more than 100 years old. We probably have Citizens United to thank for reform being such a hot topic right now. Citizens United and the super PACs, billionaires, 501c4s, and dark money that have flowed from it. Certainly all the Democrats running for president right now want voters to know that they very much support reform. The Republican candidates aren't saying that they support reform, but that seems not to be the case with Republican voters. Public opinion polls for some time now have been showing majorities in support of campaign finance reform, but the most recent one I know of, taken back in June by CBS News and New York Times, showed that 80 to 90% of Democrats and Republicans agreed that money has too much influence in elections, and that the laws on the books today aren't working and that they should be fundamentally reformed. Well, I agree with all of that. But the laws on the books today, the ones they want to reform, were themselves originally passed as reforms to deal with exactly this question of big money in elections, passed in the 1970s after Watergate. And it's those reforms that aren't working. And that's what got me to wondering, how long has reform not been working? Because campaign finance reform has a long history. The first laws were passed more than 100 years ago. And I wrote a history of those laws back in 1988. But the question I didn't ask in that book was, how well did those first laws work? Did they work any better than the laws are working today? And that's an important question, especially given what appears to be a growing consensus today about the need for reform. Because if reform didn't work any better before the 1970s than it has since the 1970s, maybe reform just doesn't work. You certainly won't have any trouble finding people who would like us to believe that. What they will say is that what's going on today isn't abnormal, it's normal. The people who are deluded as the reformers who think that they can regulate the flow of political money. Well, but what if those first laws did work? For one thing, that would mean that campaign finance reform isn't inherently unworkable. It would also mean that something important changed in the 1970s to make reform stop working, and that change is still with us. Well, to find out if those first laws worked, I came here to the archives to dig into the disclosure reports for presidential campaigns from 1912 to 1968. The first laws being passed before then, these were the campaigns, the post-reform campaigns. And so you look into the records of how these campaigns were financed, you get a sense of how well the laws were working. Now, I was just about ready to point you up there. When I say that the first laws worked, I mean the first two federal campaign finance laws. There was a ban against corporate contributions passed in 1907, and there was the first disclosure law passed in 1910. These reforms were designed to address the problem of big money in Gilded Age elections. And if I'm saying they worked, then I'm saying they must have effectively dealt with that problem. So how did I come to that conclusion? I used something that isn't in the archives because it was never meant to be made public. I used the Republican National Committee's donor list for its 1904 presidential campaign. That list was never supposed to be made public. In fact, the practice then was to simply ditch those lists. But somebody who had worked with the Republican National Committee on the 1904 and 1908 campaigns held on to the list. And in 1912, turned it over to a Senate committee that was looking into the 1912 elections. And if I could show you this, I would show you the first page of that donor list as it appeared in that committee's report. And that's important because the 1904 presidential election being the last one that occurred before the first reform laws were passed, I treated as the last Gilded Age election. And that donor list as the record for how the Republicans financed their campaign and for, you know, how big a role big money played in that campaign. Now, big money is one of those terms that gets a lot of its value from its vagueness. But money can be measured. And so I decided to define big money as contributions of $5,000 or more. That is $5,1904, something I could adjust for inflation in future years. And as for how big a role big money played in an election, that would be the share of the campaign fund that was made up of those big contributions. So all I had to do was look at what share of the 1904 campaign fund was made up of these big contributions. Well, when I did that, I found something that, as I discovered, that the people at the time in 1904 wouldn't have been at all surprised to find. Now, of course, there were no public opinion polls in 1904, but there were some great political cartoons, and this is one of them I wish you could see. It is the Democratic donkey and the Republican elephant on Wall Street. And the buildings on both sides of the street are labeled the trusts. And the trust, out of the trust, there are these spigots, and they're pouring coins into two troughs labeled the Republican Campaign Fund and the Democratic Campaign Fund. Remember, there was no disclosure here. Nobody knew for sure how the campaigns were being financed. But the guy who drew this cartoon and the publishers who published the magazine really hit it pretty much on the head. I said I was going to look at everyone who made contributions of $5,000 or more, but for just this cartoon, I want to look first at people who made those big contributions and who could be considered from, you know, the trusts. That is, people from Wall Street and big business. And when I did that, I found that Wall Street alone provided more than 60% of the Republican campaign fund in 1904. Add the top executives of the 50 biggest non-financial corporations, and it gets up to 68%. So the cartoon was pretty accurate. But really what I wanted to do here is I wanted to develop the Gilded Age standard against which to measure the changes that reform brought. So I had to find out what percentage of the 1904 campaign fund was made up of big donations. Here, maybe it's actually even a benefit that I don't have the slides, because if I had the slides, you'd already know the answer. And now I can say that share was 95%, which is just stunning. I mean, that's never happened since. Okay, when I look at later elections to determine just how much change there is in that share, I will be looking only at Republican campaigns. And that's because I have the Republicans' 1904 donor list to use as a standard, and I don't have that for the Democrats. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that the Democrats weren't as much a part of the Gilded Age as the Republicans were. The Democrats also got most of their 1904 campaign fund from Wall Street. They just didn't get it in quite the same way. My slide here is one some of you would probably recognize. It's not quite in sync with my presentation because it's Thomas Nast's famous cartoon of Boss Tweed. He drew that cartoon in the 1870s. Tweed himself died in prison in 1902, and here I am talking about 1904. But Tweed was, after all, a Gilded Age Democrat. And the Democrats in the Gilded Age, from Tweed's time on through 1892, were essentially a second business party, in the sense that they got their money from big business and Wall Street, which is where the Republicans got theirs. That changed in 1896, when the Democrats' populist wing nominated William Jennings Bryan. That sent probably 90% of the Democrats, Wall Street, and big business donors running over to the Republicans, and most of them never came back again. So in 1904, when the Republicans were getting their Wall Street money, they got it from 20-some donors. The Democrats got their Wall Street money from just 2 donors. 2 donors made up the majority of the Democrats' 1904 campaign fund, contributing a total of what today would be around $20 million. But as different as the Republican and Democrats were in 1904, they were both doing the Gilded Age thing. I wanted to come up with what Gilded Age campaign finance was like, and what it was like was getting very large contributions from a very small number of very rich people. This is what these reforms were meant to change. But the reforms didn't become laws all by themselves. They had to be passed by Congress first, and Congress wasn't going to do that on its own because passing those reforms meant regulating themselves, which they were not eager to do. So there needed to be some big external jolt to shock them into action. There needed to be a reform. And in 1905, there was one. This is a slide of Charles Evans Hughes. In 1905, Charles Evans Hughes was the counsel for a New York State legislative committee that was investigating the business practices of the big life insurance firms. Now, that in itself was a big deal, that investigation, because in those days, the big life insurance firms were essentially adjuncts of the big Wall Street banks. So this investigation was really an investigation that was getting very close to the core of the finance capitalism of the day. Well, to carry on such an investigation, the committees naturally had to subpoena the company's internal financial records. Well, they weren't even 2 weeks into the hearings, and Hughes is going through the records for New York Life. And he runs across a check that isn't very well documented. He can't even tell what account it was written on. And that turns out to be because it was written on an off-the-books account that the company hadn't admitted to having. And then he later discovers that this account wasn't even under the control of the company treasurer. It was under the control of a company vice president. And a slide of George W. Perkins, a very interesting guy. And this is not the first time he'll appear in this talk. I'll get back to him later. Perkins was not only vice president of New York Life, he was also a J.P. Morgan partner. And in 1904, he had been the biggest fundraiser for the Republicans' 1904 presidential campaign, single-handedly raising something like 10 or 11% of the campaign fund. Hughes naturally subpoenas Perkins to come testify. Well, if Hughes and the committee had had any doubts that they were onto something with this check, those doubts went away the night before Perkins was supposed to testify. The committee was barraged with telegrams and telephone calls from Albany telling them to back off. Do not put this check into evidence. So Hughes comes in the next morning to work, and the committee members go over to him and they try to get him to back off. And he won't. He says, you make me do this, I'll resign and go public. So the committee backs down. He goes into the hearing room, and Perkins makes one last attempt to get him to back off. He says, this check is dynamite. You do not want to put that into evidence. And Hughes put it into evidence. And Perkins, under oath, admits that the check had been a corporate contribution to the Republicans' 1904 presidential campaign, that they had been making such contributions since 1896, and they'd also been making regular contributions to the New York State Republican Party. Well, this was front page news across the country. And this slide is a front page article in the Los Angeles Herald. This was not just a New York story. Remember, corporate contributions were not illegal at this time, but the corporate management knew very well that popular opinion would not like it, that this was widely regarded as improper, which is why they hid these things, even in their internal records, that the public under normal circumstances would never even see. But I want to make clear what wasn't happening here and introduce Hughes in a little bit more detail. When Hughes is not backing down, he is standing up to the trusts. But Hughes was himself the senior partner in a corporate law firm in New York. The trusts were his clients. He and his wife were tight with the Rockefellers, so they were socializing with the very people who were writing the really big checks at the time. Hughes and Perkins were both in the New York Social Register, and they both belonged to the same kind of upper, and in some cases, the very same upper-class social clubs, meaning that they had probably been talking to one another in these clubs before they got together in these hearings. So this scandal is something that happened to what we would today call the 1%. But it was something that began within the 1%. It wasn't something that came from outside. I mention that because understanding how these reforms became laws helps us understand why they succeeded as well as they did when they did become laws. I really wish you could see this one. There was, the political cartoons back then were just great. And this is, and Puck had begun color cartoons, which was one of the things, unfortunately, that kind of put NAST out of business. This is a great cartoon of a life insurance company president drowning in a storm amid, a storm of revelations. And he's holding his hand up above the water, and in his hand is a receipt for campaign contributions from the Republican National Committee. And the Republican elephant is running away, and he's losing a top hat and a halo. And in the back, between the storm clouds, is a lightning bolt. And the lightning bolt is labeled publicity. Publicity is the term they used then for what we call disclosure. So what the reform was saying is that the campaign, and you mentioned one more thing because of the date, which you can't see. By the time this cartoon appeared, it was about a month after Perkins' testimony. By this time, the presidents of the other life insurance firms had admitted that they too had been making these these campaign contributions. So what the cartoon is saying is that these campaign finance revelations had caused Republican and Democratic newspapers to call for campaign finance reform. And they were calling for two reforms in particular. They were calling for a ban against corporate contributions and a publicity or disclosure law. Well, now certainly those reforms fit the situation, but why were all the newspapers, Republican and Democratic, calling for these two reforms in particular? That's because the newspapers knew, but had not had much occasion to write about it before, that there were two former members of Congress who had already drafted the bills for these reforms and had been trying, without any success, to get them enacted into law. The scandal changed all that, and it brought these guys out of the shadows onto the center stage, into the national spotlight, and they made the most of that. They formed the first campaign finance reform organization to press for enactment of their reforms. Well, we saw that Congress did pass a bill prohibiting corporations from making campaign contributions in 1907. But Congress rejected the disclosure law in 1907 and rejected it again in 1908. And that's what makes the 1908 presidential campaign interesting. William Howard Taft was the Republican candidate in 1908. Taft supported disclosure. And he had tried behind the scenes, obviously with no success, to get Congress to pass the disclosure law. Then he gets nominated for president, and he simply does an end run around Congress. He says, it doesn't matter to me that Congress didn't pass a disclosure law. I'm going to abide by the New York State law, because New York State had passed a disclosure law in 1906. Taft said, my campaign headquarters are in New York City. I'm going to comply with New York State law. And then he went further and he said, what's more, when I'm in the White House, I'm going to see to it that Congress passes a federal disclosure law. Okay, Taft, of course, wins the election. And about a week after the election, he releases his disclosure report. And I wish you could see this slide too, because the very next morning, Taft's almost entire donor list appears in the newspapers. It appears in the New York Times, and the New York Tribune, the New York World. It appeared in the Washington Post and the Boston Globe, and excerpts of it in other newspapers around the country. This sort of thing would have been a nightmare in 1904. But in 1908, it really showed just what a brilliant stroke this had been on Taft's part, because it proved to be a public relations bonanza for Taft and for the Republican Party. And I would show you why. Imagine you've got a bar graph here, and on the left is a graph, is a bar for 1904 showing 95% of a campaign fund made up of big contributions. And the next one is a shorter bar for 1908, and that's only 32%. I mean, that's a huge change. The newspapers noticed that, and they were enthusiastically approving of it. Of course, Taft then goes ahead and makes good on his second promise. He gets Congress to pass a disclosure law. Okay, now we have these first two reforms on the books. How well are they going to work after 1908? Because 1908 was an unusual election. It was being held in the wake of a scandal. It was still in people's memories. It was being held right after Congress had refused to pass a reform law, so that there was in the middle of a reform debate. But those were going to pass out of people's memories after a few years. And so we're going to see how well reform worked when these things were in the past. I'm going to jump over 1912, because 1912 is when Theodore Roosevelt split the Republican Party by running as a progressive. And what that meant was a lot of the Republican Party's big donors just didn't give that year. But in 1916, the party reunited behind, and here's another slide of Charles Evans Hughes. The 1905 insurance investigation, this made Hughes a national hero overnight and a rising star in the Republican Party. The year after the investigation, in 1906, he was elected governor of New York, and then he was appointed to the Supreme Court. And in 1916, he stepped down from the Supreme Court to run for president. When the party reunited behind him, it brought back all those big donors who didn't give in 1908 and didn't give again in 1912. In 1916, they opened up their checkbooks again. The Republicans raised a big campaign fund. So if reform was going to take, it was going to take in 1916. And it did. You know, imagine you've got one more bar on that bar chart. The share of Hughes's campaign fund that was made up of big contributions was really about the same as Taft's, 2% lower. So reform seemed to be working. And then I have another slide moving this over to 1928, and imagine another short bar. because even in 1928, this is the real roaring 20s election because both parties raised big campaign funds in 1928. Even so, the share of the Republican campaign fund in 1928 was only 31%. So it looks like not only had reform worked, but the pattern was that the share of campaign funds made up of big contributions dropped sharply after 1904 and then kind of leveled off for several decades. But how long is this going to last? We just look all the way ahead to the 70s to see. And we can see that it does continue, and I won't do too much explanation because a lot of this was designed around explaining what you can see on a chart. But the percentage of share of campaign funds made up of big contributions continues to go down in 1936. The one thing I would like to explain, even though you can't see it, is that in 1956, the share goes down to 0. Now, this is definitely an outlier. It didn't happen in any other election. But it's explainable because 1956 was in the middle of post-war prosperity. Partisan polarization was at very low levels. Inequalities of income and wealth were still at historically low levels from the Depression. Dwight Eisenhower was a very popular president. He'd been elected in 1952 with lots of Democratic votes. And in 1956, he was cruising to a fairly easy reelection. So apparently not a single Republican donor thought it was necessary to write a check that was big enough to meet my definition of a big contribution, hence 0%. Then we get to 1972. 1972, remember, is the election that produced Watergate. This was a year in which the Republicans raised what was then the biggest campaign fund in history. The percentage of that campaign fund that made up of big contributions was 36%. Now, maybe you expected it to be bigger, but it wasn't, and we'll get into that later why. That's, of course, far short of the 95% in 1904, but we never get back to that. That 95% from the first Gilded Age, that was something that never happens again. The important thing about the 36% share in 1972 is that it is bigger than any of the previous post-reform elections, which is a pretty good sign that reform had been working for more than 50 years, and it had really pretty much beginning to stop work in the 1970s. All right, so I've been measuring the success of reform by measuring the share of campaign funds made up of big contributions. And it was working for more than 50 years. And statistically, that can be explained by two things. Big donors were writing smaller checks, and the party was adding lots more donors, and they were all small donors. And the important thing about these two trends is that these were both voluntary. These were not required by law. The big donors were consciously making smaller contributions just as a way to adapt to disclosure. And the parties were doing the same thing to adapt to disclosure. I mean, this was a bigger deal for the parties because fundraising for presidential elections under the Gilded Age was easy. It didn't require many people. It wasn't very time consuming. It wasn't very expensive. Like I said, it was a matter of getting really large contributions from a very small number of very rich people. What that meant was that raising a presidential campaign fund in the Gilded Age was something that they didn't even start doing until September of the election year. But if you're going to add more small donors, you're making a big change. That means more people, more organization, more money. And yet the parties did this voluntarily as a way of adapting to disclosure. Maybe rather than, there's a slide here that shows just how successful the Republicans were at broadening their donor base. It went from like 4,000 donors in 1904 up to 144,000 donors by 1928. Even in 1936, during the Depression, the Republicans had more than twice as many donors as they had had in 1916. And in 1972, and remember, this was an election that was known for its big contributions, they had 600,000 donors. And of course, that means hundreds of thousands of really small donors. So these small donor campaigns that began in 1908 continued even after other aspects of reform had stopped working. And I want to make clear, too, that this was not simply an increase in absolute numbers. It was also an increase as a percent of the national population. So that in 1904, those 4,000 donors, they made up 0.00005% of the population. Get to 1972, and those 600,000 donors made up 0.006% of the population. Now, those are both really thin slices of the population. That mostly tells you, what the likely boundaries are for how many donors we can get. But what it also meant was that the Republicans, even after they had stopped obeying reform, continued to broaden their donor base. Now, about those smaller contributions, how did I measure that? Again, imagine a bar graph, and the graph for the number on the bar for 1904 is 3.2. What I mean by that is that I defined a big contribution as $5,1904, and I just assumed that people would be making big contributions all the way through, which turned out, except for 1956, to be true. What I didn't know was whether the biggest contributions in those later elections would be bigger than, smaller than, same size as the biggest contributions in 1904. And I wanted to know that because that too would be a measure of how well the reform laws were working. So what I did in each election was I took an average of the big contributions and compared the average to the size of the base big contribution. Now, what I mean by that is that imagine this bar with a 3.2 number in it. In 1904, I found that the average big contribution was a little more than $16,000, which was 3.2 times the $5,000 base big contribution. So if the biggest contributions in later elections were going to get smaller, that number would get smaller. And if you could see the chart, you would see that it did get smaller and that it followed pretty much the same pattern as the falling share of campaign funds made up of big contributions. Dropped sharply after 1904 and then continued on a fairly low level. And then jumping ahead to the 1970s, can see that the size of the contributions continued to go down into the 1960s. 1968 went back up again. 1972, we find that for the first time, the biggest contributions were bigger than the biggest contributions made in 1904. I mean, again, a pretty good sign that reform was not working. Now, I've said that reform worked for more than 50 years. But what about that 1907 law prohibiting corporate contributions? How well did that work? And the truth is, there is no way to know for sure, because that law is, always has been, always will be unenforceable. And it's unenforceable because the only way to know if a corporation has been making a contribution is to get access to its internal records. And there's almost never any cause to do that. And I'm coming out another front page story from the 1905 investigation. What that investigating committee discovered in 1905 was that even if you do get access to their internal records, you still may not find out. The check that exposed everything in 1905, remember, Hughes discovered that by accident. And that's the only way we have ever discovered whether corporations are made contributions, by accident or because of whistleblowers. I wanted to get a general sense, though, of how well that law was working, so I used that check as a model. That check was not written directly from New York Life to the Republican Party. It was a check written by New York Life to George Perkins, which he deposited in his account, and then wrote a check on his personal account to the Republican Party. So the corporate contribution was disguised as an individual contribution. That has always been, and still is today, a common way of disguising corporate contributions. So I decided, let's imagine the worst. Let's imagine that nobody pays any attention at all to this 1907 law. And I'd been looking at big contributions from the top executives of the biggest banks and the biggest non-financial corporations. I said, let's just assume that every one of these is an illegal corporate contribution. And what I found was that even if that were true, as it almost certainly was not, there was still less corporate money in elections than there had been in 1904. So here was this law that was not only unenforceable, it was not enforced. And yet, in some way, it was still having an effect. It was working. And here I'm getting past the documents that are here in the archives, but I think it's an important point. It actually even still seemed to be working under Watergate. Now remember, one of the big things about Watergate was the illegal campaign corporate contributions. And these were not things done with a wink and a nod so that the person getting the contribution has plausible deniability. The Nixon Campaign Committee and the corporate executives sat down and deliberately negotiated the size of contributions they all knew were illegal. This was a deliberate flouting of the law. And yet, and here imagine the logos for Gulf Oil, Phillips 66, and Ashland Oil Companies. Those three companies made the largest contributions, $100,000 each. And that was pretty shocking in 1972, except that $100,1972 was worth less than half what New York Life had given the Republicans back in 1904. So even in Watergate, when there wasn't even a pretense of obeying the law, they still somehow kept down the level of the illegal contributions. Okay, I mean, to recap, reform worked generally, and it worked because the contribution sizes got smaller and the parties increased the number of donors. But then the question becomes why this were voluntary, which means that the laws worked because to some extent the economic and political elites went along with it. And the question is, why did they go along with it? Weren't they giving up some privilege that they'd had in 1904? But one thing that they probably learned very soon was that even if the big donors were no longer providing a majority of campaign funds, they were still providing hugely disproportionate shares of those campaign funds. In 1908, just as an example, and I use 1908 because that was the example when everybody was on their best behavior. Big contributions made up only 32% of the campaign fund. But the people who made those big contributions were only 49 of them. They were 0.4% of the donors in that campaign. And that is the kind of pattern that continued throughout. So eventually you noticed, the big donors are writing smaller checks, but they're still the biggest checks. And the people who are writing those checks are still the ones who have the same access in Washington that they had in 1904. Reform didn't change that. All those small donors coming in, those hundreds of thousands of small donors, those look really good on disclosure reports. But those people don't come in with any political influence. So it could be that the elites of the day went along with reform because they saw that reform maybe wasn't really as big a threat as it seemed to be at first. So when I say that reform worked, I don't mean that it replaced a Gilded Age system. What I mean is that it modified that system. And a modified version of that Gilded Age system is, I think, the best we can expect from reform as long as we have a privately financed system. Now, it could be that, as I said, that the 1% of the time went along with reform because they thought maybe this really was a fairly moderate thing after all. I would have loved to find the notes for a secret meeting of the 1% where they talked about this and came to some decision. I didn't, not surprisingly. But I did find something pretty interesting, and this would be my last slide, and we're getting back to George W. Perkins. Now remember, Perkins, this guy embodied the Gilded Age system that reform was meant to change. So how did he respond to reform? And I discovered that when I ran across a memo he wrote in his personal papers, a memo he wrote in 1908 to the Republican National Committee advising them on how to raise a campaign fund in a time of reform. And he starts off mentioning the 1907 law prohibiting corporate contributions and New York State's 1906 disclosure law. And here's what he says. Instead of being a detriment, as some people think, I mean, here he's acknowledging that not all of his one percenters are fully, in agreement with him on this. Instead of being a detriment, the laws furnish the best possible argument with which to raise money in exactly the manner the country would approve of. That is, from a large number of individuals scattered throughout the country. San Francisco, Denver, Omaha, St. Paul, Cincinnati. Such an accomplishment would carry great moral force with it. This sort of program would be known throughout the country and would be the best proof that the Republican National Committee is not after the corporations, but is making a dignified, systematic appeal to the entire country. And this was pretty much what Taft did in 1908. This memo reads almost like a blueprint for post-Gilded Age fundraising. But notice what Perkins didn't say. He didn't say hooray for reform. He was no convert. He would have been perfectly happy had there been no scandal and no reform. But he was a very practical guy. And reform was a political fact, and it was a political fact that wasn't going to go away. And he said, okay, so, we have a choice. We can fight it or we can make the best of it. And what he's saying in this memo is it simply makes sense to make the best of it. We don't look good right now because of this scandal. If we comply with reform, we'll be raising money in exactly the way people think we should, and it will make us look good. And remember, we still don't lose any of the access we had in Washington. So this is simply good politics. It's like enlightened self-interest. And that seems to be the big difference between the first Gilded Age and our own Gilded Age. Perkins's counterparts today seem to have made a different choice. Supreme Court in 1976 in Buckley v. Vallejo decided that you should fight reform, not go along with it. The billionaires today may think that they are spending in their self-interest, but it doesn't look to me to be very enlightened at all, which is about as close as I can come to explaining why reform worked then and doesn't work now. Now that's really the end of my talk, but I want to make a comment about the reports I used to write this book and to develop this talk. Those reports, the disclosure reports for presidential campaigns from 1912 through 1968, that's an immensely valuable resource for political history and for students of campaign finance. And it is woefully underused. I mean, over the years, when I've actually had people tell me that these reports don't exist. Well, they do exist, and they are not being used. I think I can understand why they're underused. And it really has to do with the way academic disciplines are set up. I'm a political scientist, and as a group, we naturally write about campaign finance, but as a group, we don't usually pay a lot of attention to history. Political historians write about history, but they pay even less attention to campaign finance. So this resource is underused because it doesn't fall squarely within either one of those academic disciplines. And I'm hoping that in some way, I hope my book raises awareness of this resource and leads it to be more widely used. That's it. And I think we still have a few minutes for questions.
I apologize for coming in late. Could you describe in excruciating detail what one of those finance reports contains?
Oh, yeah, it is simply lists of names. I don't know if anyone has gone to the FEC, gone online and looked at those reports. Nothing at all like that. What you look at is what seems to have happened with the committees when they were making up these reports. As a donation came in, somebody wrote it down: name, address, amount, date. Next one comes in, name, address, amount, date. So you have $5, $500, 25 cents, $1,000. And it's just one name after another like this in no particular order, not even necessarily in a chronological order. And here's something that I had been talking about with Richard, and he was going to ask. We sometimes can't even tell whether the reports are complete, whether there are even missing pages. So to use these reports means to sit down and spend a lot of time just going page after page, writing down, because I'm looking only at for people who give a certain amount or above, say $5,000. So somebody gives 1,000, I think, well, maybe he'll give more, so I write him down. Somebody else gives 2,000, maybe he'll give more. And some of them do give more and some of them don't. And some of them may give $500 and I won't pay attention to them, but then later on they'll give more, 500, and I miss some. So it is just a list of names, one name after another, and that's all those reports are.
So you're talking about the bound volumes, and you're not talking about, say, the individual files for Senate campaign contributions?
For Senate campaign?
Yes.
Oh, now I looked, the law did not work very well for the congressional campaigns. And remember, this law was passed in 1910 before the Senate was an elected body. But I did look at, in fact, I did look at some of the Senate campaign reports because I was kind of curious about this. I had heard that these were useless, and they are. They are useless.
Thank you, because that confirmed what I had thought.
And where are these reports? Are here in the archive?
They are here, and they are in the House records, in the records of the clerk of the House. And that's because in 1910, when the law was passed, it applied only to House candidates and presidential candidates, and they all filed their reports with the clerk of the House. And let me mention something here that might be of interest to this audience in particular. I wouldn't have been able to write this book had the disclosure law not required people to write these reports. But that disclosure law actually didn't have anything to do with ensuring that those reports would eventually end up here in the archives. Because the law said that the clerk of the House only had to keep these reports for 15 months. After that, they could ditch them. And we're just lucky that the two men who were clerk of the House from the time that the disclosure law took effect to sometime in the late 1930s, whenever these reports came over here, didn't ditch them. They kept them on file, and good for them. Let me read you an account of what it was like to do research in those files when they were still in the clerk's office. And I think you know who I'm going to be reading from. This is an account by Louise Acker. I think probably most of you have never heard of her. She was a political scientist at Wellesley College. She was, in her research, what she was researching was a book that she wrote in 1932. It wasn't the first book about campaign finance. There had been one before. But she followed up her book with a series of articles in the American Political Science Review, and then did a series of lectures on presidential campaign funds at Boston College. Louise Acker is essentially the founding mother of campaign finance studies. And here's the way she described looking at those reports. When one asks for the files, one is taken into a tiny washroom where a series of dusty, paper-covered bundles repose upon an upper shelf. By climbing upon a chair and digging about among the bundles, one usually finds what one wants. One is likely to find the oldest of these reports in a very mutilated condition. Inasmuch as there is no obligation under the law even to retain these reports, it is, of course, not surprising that they are not treated with more care. So imagine going to look for the files at something and being shown into a bathroom. So. Yeah.
Going beyond method, you concluded the normative parts of your lecture with a pessimistic attitude of what reform today could achieve. Mm-hmm. Do you think we cannot reform campaign finance any longer?
Well, there are really two questions there. One is, politically, can it be done? And I'd say politically right now it can't be done. I mean, there's no way that you're going to get anything through Congress. And even if by some miracle you would get something through Congress, it wouldn't get by the Supreme Court. And it's going to require more than simply the Democrats getting majorities in both houses of Congress. Because if the Republicans are still going to be opposed to reform, reform isn't going to work. I mean, remember, reform worked in the past because both parties went along with it. I mean, the laws that we've got now, the laws that aren't working, the laws that the Supreme Court tried to, stop, those 1974 laws were passed by majorities of both houses and both parties in both houses of Congress. Unless we get back to a politics like that, reform simply isn't going to work. But assuming that you could get back to a situation like that, yeah, I mean, one reform I would like to see is what's called a public finance voucher system, where rather than having public financing as giving the money to the candidates or to the parties, you simply give every voter a voucher for, say, $50. They can only use that to make campaign contributions. But once people have those, everybody has those, suddenly every voter is going to have something that every candidate very much wants. And I think that would be a big spur to political organization and political activity. Yeah. We were actually a little over time, so.
You did a superb job in so many ways, especially for compensating for some of our technical shortcomings. The description of your documents was wonderful. We thank you for that, and for writing a book that I recommend to all of you. It's a real eye-opening book. And thank you so much, Robert. We look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Thank you. Thank you.